Welcome back, everybody. Today on my channel we are going to do an interesting video that I wanted to do for a long time, and that is the small block Chevrolet engine versus the small block Ford engine. Now there's been rivalries for as long as I've been alive, as long as I can remember, between Ford and Chevy guys. Ford guys criticizing the Chevy guys criticizing the Ford guys, saying that we have the better engine, we have the better power plant, ours is superior to yours. Well, today we're going to find out how much truth there is to that. And so we're going to delve into the architecture of the small block Chevy and the small block Ford. We're not so much going to talk about power output, because the reality is the engine configuration as far as bore and stroke combination between the 350 Chevy and the 351 Windsor engine is very similar. And if you take and you put the similar cylinder heads and cam package on them, they basically perform pretty much the same. We haven't really seen a huge difference in power output, but today we want to specifically look at the architecture of the block and the design of the engines and some of the things that the engineers did differently between the Ford and the Chevrolet that do make a difference as far as longevity and reliability and performance go. So I want to delve into this. I want to take a look at the Ford and Chevy. I'm going to start off with the Ford small blocks. Ford has, in the Windsor family, they actually have a couple of different versions of the engine. They have a couple of different deck heights and so forth. The small block Chevrolet really basically had the same deck height and the same configuration all the way back to its conception in 1955. However, there were a couple of different crankshaft diameter sizes. There is a small journal crankshaft that was in the pre-like 1968 Chevrolets that had a slightly smaller main journal and a slightly smaller rod journal. They went to what they call the large journal crankshaft in 1968, where they just added some diameter to the crank journal, the mains and the rods, about 100 thousandths or so. And so there is a distinction there, but for the most part the Chevrolet has remained the same and pretty much everything is interchangeable. There's been a lot more changes and some variations on the Ford engines, but nevertheless we want to delve into and take a look at these two small blocks, some of their design features, and whether or not one is actually better than the other. So let's get into it. Okay, so here we are at my little tiny assembly area here. You know, when you guys assemble engines, you have to have an area that's really clean. You don't want to need anything dirty in that area. That's separate from the rest of the shop. So I've set up this little area here with an air conditioner and so forth, and a motion detector light that just keeps coming off and on. One of these days on one of these videos, you guys, I'm just going to prepare you for this. I'm just going to snap and smash that motion detector light on camera with a hammer and then just go buy another one. So these are the Ford, this is the Ford small block. Let's take a look at this. What we have here is a 351 cubic inch Windsor engine. Windsor denotes the factory that the engine was made at. That is Windsor, Ontario, Canada, right across the river from Michigan. That's where they manufactured these. So a couple of things about these two engines. They are different in one respect, and a couple actually. If you look at the main bore size of the 302, and then you go over and you look at the main bore size of the 351, it's obviously, you can see a huge difference there. The 302 has a much smaller main bore size. The 351 has this big beefy 3-inch diameter main. The one thing I want you to notice about these blocks, if we take a look at them, if you look at the 351 Windsor, one of the other big differences is that it is a taller deck block. Now, deck height is from the center of the bore here, the main bore, to the deck of the block. So that would be the center to here. The 302 has a much shorter deck. If you look at this area where the deck sits flush here on this 302, you'll notice that it's really close to this water pump flange and this bolt hole. If you come over to the 351 Windsor and you look at the difference from the flange of the water pump up to the deck of the block, we got all this extra meat here. So if we actually just take a basic measurement, you know, nothing real precise here, but if I just kind of eyeball this and I go from the center of that bolt hole, because the blocks are the same, the timing chain cover on these two engines is the same, the water pump flanges are the same, everything down here is the same. Of course, this has a bigger bore. I'm going to wave my arms here and get that light to come on. So it takes the same cover, it takes the same front seal. Everything up here is similar. Most of the bolt-on accessories are the same as far as the flanges go. The distributor mounting is the same, but obviously the 351 is going to have a longer distributor because it's a greater distance from the deck of the block here down to where the oil pump is driven in the camshaft. So this is my reading that I took here on this 351, basically there. If we come over to the 302 and we take a look at this, you can see the difference. This is my deck and my bolt holes right here. So the deck on the 351 is literally quite a bit tall, is literally that much taller or thereabouts, very similar. And then also, like I said earlier, if I take just a bore measurement here on the 302 main bore, the diameter of the main bore, and then we look at the 351 over here, I mean, wow, what a difference. That's quite a bit larger. But what's interesting is the architecture is similar. If you look at the timing chain cover bolt pattern, you look at where the plugs are, you look at the diameter of the cam tunnel and all of that, everything is the same. So very similar engines. They just took the same design, which is a very good design, called their small block, their Windsor, whatever you want to call it. It's very similar. Now what's interesting is these engines not only take the same timing chain cover, they also have a similar motor mount pattern, although the motor mounts are a little bit different. The cylinder heads that are on the 302 will bolt right onto a 351 Windsor if you drill the bolt holes out to 1/2 inch, because the 351 has a 1/2 inch bolt and the 302 has a 7/16 coarse thread bolt. Just like this, the 302 has the same size head bolt as the small block Chevy, and the 351 has a much bigger, beefier head bolt. It was just made as a larger, stronger version of the 302. They both have the same bore size. Now when we start talking about bore size, they both have the same 4-inch bore. So if I take a bore measurement here and I put it on 351, they're similar. Now we've bored this. This block has been machined. I bored it 30 over. This is a standard bore block that has not been machined yet. That's going to get probably a sleeve because it had some rust in it. But the fact of the matter is the factory bore size on these engines is both 4 inches. The head bolt pattern, where the head bolts on, and Fords use a very common 10 bolt pattern, the head bolt pattern is exactly the same. They take the same head gasket and the heads can be interchanged, although there are some caveats with that as far as compression ratio and stuff goes, but they definitely will bolt on. Although I would recommend doing some research before you swap heads between 351 and 302. One thing I would mention about the 302, so Chevrolet has, and we're not really going to talk about the 305 engine, but Chevrolet has a 305 cubic inch engine that a lot of people want to compare to the 302, which is not really a good comparison, guys, because the 302 Ford is far superior to a 305 Chevy. What they did with this 302 to make 302 cubic inches is it has a 4-inch bore, just like the 351 and the 350 Chevy. But it has a really short stroke. It has a 3-inch stroke, which gives us 302 cubic inches. Chevrolet actually made a hot rod 302 engine for their Z28s for the Can-Am Racing series, so the early 302 Chevy was the same configuration as a 302 Ford. It had a 4-inch bore and a 3-inch stroke. Now with the 351 engine, What they've done is they made a taller deck height and they gave it a 3.5 inch stroke. So they went with the same bore as the 350 and they made a 3.5 inch stroke. Chevy has a 4-inch bore, but it has a slightly shorter stroke, 3.480, just a tiny bit less than the Ford, which that's how Ford got that extra cubic inch. They made a 3.5 inch stroke. So 3-inch stroke, the piston travels 3 inches from top to bottom, and 3.5 inch stroke, the piston travels 3.5 inches. One of the main reasons that they wanted a bigger engine, a stronger engine, but one of the main reasons that they went with the taller deck is that getting a 3.5 inch stroke into this little 302 is nearly impossible. You can do a lot of things if you want to build a stroker, but Ford said, you know what, we need a taller block because we're going to have a much longer stroke, and that's what they did. Interestingly enough, they both take the same lifter. They have the same lifter bores. Actually, you can interchange the camshafts. Although the 351 does have a different firing order, and in fact the 302 had a couple of different firing orders, so you really got to watch that, make sure you know which firing order you get. But they will interchange. If you take a 351 cam and put it in a 302, it'll work, but you're just going to have to arrange your wires in a different firing order to get it to run. So that's pretty normal for these. And again, one thing I really like about the 351 is this distributor mounting. If you recall, the distributor mounting on the Chevrolet goes through the intake manifold. The problem with that is if I resurface the block or deck the head, that's going to change where that manifold sits, and it's going to change the way the gear meshes with the cam, and sometimes we actually have to shim that on the Chevy, and it's a real pain in the butt. Ford really did a good engineering job here when they made the distributor mounting fixed into the block so it can't be changed. So that's a pretty good aspect of this engine. Now if we take a look at the backside, very similar. And obviously we have a bigger main, but if you look at the bell housing bolt pattern, it is the same. It's interesting that Ford made these so that they take the same bell housing. If you measure the distance between the bolts here from the bell housing pattern, it's exactly the same. So you can bolt up the C6 transmission that was with the 351 Windsor to a 302 and have a stronger transmission. You can also go the other way and put the 302 transmission on the 351, but I don't know why you would do that unless you were just trying to sell the car or something. But similar gallery plugs, similar cam tunnel location. We do have a big difference here in the deck. So you can see this is right here at this flange. This is way above that flange, so it is a taller block. So all in all, the difference between a 351 Windsor and a 302 or 289 or 260 or whatever is basically the deck height and the bore of the crank. They do obviously take a different piston because of the height and a different connecting rod. So if we take a look at the 302 connecting rod and the 351 rod, now we're going to build this, so I've already got the pistons and rods assembled here. But if you take a look at the rods, it's a significant difference. The crankshaft has much larger journals on the 351. If you look at the difference in bore size and the length of the rod, if I line this 302 rod up with the pin location on that 351, you can see, wow, quite a difference there. So the 302 has a lot shorter rod and a shorter stroke crank. The 351 obviously has a different piston pin location here, and it has a much larger, beefy, stronger connecting rods. The one drawback, the thing I've never liked about the 302 is let's be careful with that. If you look at the rod bolts here, they're dinky. They're 5/16 and they have a little dinky nut. In fact, the torque on them is only like 23 foot-pounds. The 351 has a big, beefy 3/8 rod stud and nut, just like a 350 Chevy. It's much larger, much stronger. So this is really going to be a much more durable engine as far as the connecting rods go. So I really like the 351s. Whenever I do a 302, which is what we're going to do with these, I always take and press these bolts out and put ARP bolts in these because they're so dinky. But ARP, once you get ARPs in this, even the smaller diameter rod studs, they work pretty good with the air piece. So the rods are definitely different on these two. The 351 does have the stronger and the beefier rod. And of course, we've gone in with a flat top piston here. We're not going to put the stock dish pistons back in this build. Now, one of the things that I really like about the Ford small blocks is that they have a retaining plate from the factory on their engine. It's a plate that retains the cam. Now, Chevrolet didn't have this until they got into the Vortec years. Some of the later TBIs had it, but this makes it really easy to upgrade to a roller cam. You can put this guy on here, and this will keep that roller cam from walking out of the block. On the early Chevrolet, you got to run a thrust button with your roller cam to upgrade, and you got to use a retrofit roller kit, which is really expensive. The later Vortex did actually have a plate up here that was drilled, but that wasn't until 1996. Ford was using a retaining plate on these small blocks for the cam all the way back into the engine design's conception. Well back into the 60s, and so they really did a good job. You can buy a retrofit kit. Now, the factory roller blocks also had a retaining plate on them, but the thing is, the Ford Windsors that went to factory rollers like in the late 80s, early 90s, the camshaft is different between the early engine and the factory roller, but you can get an aftermarket roller kit. And since you have the retaining plate already from the factory, it really is a lot less expensive to upgrade one of these early blocks to a roller. Probably half as much as the earlier small block 350. So the fact that the Ford put a retaining plate on here from the factory is a huge benefit. There's actually a kit you can buy that replicates the factory roller setup with the dog bones in the lifter valley and so forth, and it's a lot cheaper than like the tie bar. Like we're doing a Chevrolet here and we've got these tie bar lifters. This is a solid roller going in a small block Chevy, but we have to have these tie bar lifters instead of the crow's foot that goes over the lifters from the factory. On the Fords, you can buy the setup that has the crow's foot and the spider assembly and put that in the early block. It's just maybe half as much on the cost to upgrade to a roller. So that's one big advantage to the Ford. 351 and 302 crank side by side, you can see the obvious difference. The 351 is just a much bigger, stronger, beefier crank. The 302 is a lot smaller and lighter. These work great if you have, you want to spin this thing up to a high RPM and you got a smaller car. The smaller diameter main and rod is much more conducive to higher RPMs. However, if you have a heavy vehicle, like especially if it's a truck or something, you're probably going to want to go with the 351. It's just a much stronger. It can handle more stress, it can handle more torque and so forth. So the contrast, they're basically the same length because the blocks are the same length, but you can see that the 351 is a much larger, beefier crank. If you look at the throws here, look at these counterweights, these are just way bigger, just a bigger diameter, more meat there. So the 351 compared to the 302, I would say 302s are great if you want to build a little hot rod and the car's light. But if you got a bigger, heavier vehicle, I would go with the 351 Windsor. And actually, I'd go with the 351 Windsor if I could in anything, because it has a lot more power and torque potential. Okay, guys, so now this is the portion of the video that I know a lot of you are waiting for. Now we're going to take and we're going to compare our 351 engine here to our 350 Chevy engine. As far as strength goes, the 351W and the 350 Chevy are very similar. They can both handle similar amounts of horsepower. One big advantage to the 350 Chevy is you can actually get a 4-bolt main block. If you take and put ARP studs in the 351, they do have a big, beefy, pretty strong cap that competes just about as well as the 4-bolt main 350. But if you put ARPs in here, and especially if you add a splayed cap or something, the 350 main web area, the Chevy as far as tests have gone, seems to be superior to the strength of the 351 Windsor. But the reality is that anything that you're going to do with these engines on the street, the 351 you know, don't get me wrong, it's not a weak motor. It's actually a very strong engine. And it's pretty much going to handle anything you're going to throw at it, unless you just go all out and you just decide you're going to build an all-out race motor. But in that situation, you're probably not going to use a factory block anyway. And that goes for Chevy and Ford. You're probably going to use a Dart or some kind of aftermarket block for hardcore racing. For the street, they're both really adequate. These blocks can be built up to 500 horsepower, no problem. Of course, you're going to want to upgrade the main bolts to ARP studs and so forth, and there's other things you got to do, but the blocks can take it. The Chevy does have the factory 4-bolt. That is an option. They also have a 2-bolt version. There's a lot of 2-bolt Chevys. All the caps in that case are going to look like this. This happens to be a 4-bolt main block. They both have the same size bore and a similar stroke. The 350 Chevy has a 3.480 stroke. The 351 Windsor has a 3.5-inch stroke. The 351 Windsor and the 350 Chevy, like I said, both have a 4-inch bore. The 351 and the Ford has 10 head bolts, 5 on top, 5 on bottom. One big advantage to the Chevrolet, and the reason that these are less prone to blowing head gaskets, especially under performance situations, is that we have 17 head bolts. GM surrounded every cylinder with head bolts, so instead of 10, every head has 7 more bolts. That does make the clamping force and the situation with the cylinder heads better on the Chevrolet. Now, this is a later model roller block that has these provisions, but remember, Chevrolet didn't start this until the late 80s, early 90s. And so these are for the spider assembly that goes in here, and this is set up for a crow's foot and a roller lifter. But you can very easily drill the spider assembly holes here, and you've already got a retaining plate on the Ford from the factory and make that a roller, no problem. We take a look at the front of the Chevrolet block. The one advantage to this is it has a steel timing cover that goes on here that bolts on, and the water pump has its own mounting flanges. Now, the water pump on the 351 has mounting flanges too, but there's an aluminum cover that goes up here, and the water pump bolts to the aluminum cover, and the coolant goes through a hole in that aluminum cover, which has a tendency they can corrode. So on this one, they separated the water pump. Don't have to worry about it. This does have the provision for the retaining plate for the roller cam, but again, GM didn't start that until, geez, like 90s. These all went all the way back to the 60s with the retaining plate, so that was a better deal. If we look at the connecting rods for the Ford and the small block Chevy, the Ford does have a bigger diameter rod bore, but that's not necessarily a good thing for RPMs. The Chevrolet rod is pretty strong, pretty beefy. It's a little bit shorter than that 351 rod, not quite as heavy, which is good for RPMs. But again, these are really strong and you're not going to have a lot of problems with them. But the Chevrolet rod's very stout. They are forged from the factory. You get ARP bolts in here and you got something really good going on. Then we take a look at the back side of the block. Obviously a GM bolt pattern, a Ford bolt pattern. One thing I will say about the Chevrolet bolt pattern is this bell housing bolt pattern is the same for every Chevy, from the 4 cylinders back in the 60s all the way to the big blocks. They didn't change a thing. It's the same pattern. Ford had a bunch of different bell housing patterns for different engine families and even in the same families. So that actually caused a lot more issues with the Ford as far as fitment and stuff goes. Chevrolet, you can take a 6-cylinder inline Chevy 250 out of a pickup truck and bolt a 454 into it, and it bolts up to the same transmission. This bolt pattern is universal for all Chevys, and that's a big advantage to these. They both had either 1-piece or 2-piece rear main seals. So all in all, I would say that these blocks are pretty similar. It kind of depends on what you want. You hear people say, Ford sucks, I love Chevy, or Chevy sucks, I love Ford. The reality is, guys, they're very similar. There's not a lot of differences. They have caveats. Each one has an advantage in an area that the other one doesn't have. But to say that one sucks and one is great is just ridiculous. The 351 Windsor and the 350 Chevy, I'd say build either one of them. because you're going to get great power and durability out of either engine. It really doesn't make a difference. So this idea where Ford is better than Chevy or Chevy is better than Ford, the reality is the engineering on these blocks is actually very similar. Similar strokes, similar bore, and in dyno tests we know for a fact that they perform in a similar fashion with the similar camshaft and cylinder heads. What I would say is the factory Ford heads are terrible at flowing. The Chevrolet heads are just a little bit less terrible. If you're going to build anything with power, man, you got to go with rock something that's going to give you good flow into the engine. The factory heads, even the best flowing factory heads, which would be the Vortec on these and the GT40s on these, were mediocre at best compared to aftermarket heads. I mean, they work okay, but you know, if you really want to get into performance, you really need to ditch the factory iron heads that came on either one of these. If we look at the 351 crank compared to the 350 Chevy crank, again, they're similar in throw size here. The Chevrolet does have a smaller journal main. It's bigger than the 302, but it's not the 3 inches. Now, I would say that of these two cranks, I actually prefer this smaller journal because at a given RPM, I'm going to have less bearing speed. Think of a merry-go-round. The further you are out on that merry-go-round, the faster the speed is here. It's geometric progression. So the 350 crank is actually going to do better at high RPM than the 351 Windsor crank. One of the issues with the 351 Windsor and the 351M that they had later with the same size 3-inch main was that at high RPMs, the bearings, they'd start smoking the bearings here because of the high bearing speed, whereas the smaller diameter journal cranks wouldn't do that. They'd turn real high RPMs and it wouldn't cause a problem like that. What's interesting is the 351 Cleveland, which is a totally different engine. The only thing it has in common with the Windsor is the fact that it has the same cubic inch size. It has actually a lot smaller main journal here, very similar to the 350 Chevy. So it was actually better for RPMing for sure. So there you have it, guys. The conclusion that we have to come to when it comes to small block Chevys and small block Fords is that the reality is it's a 4-inch bore, basically a 3.5-inch stroke V8, 90-degree V8, and they both perform very similarly. Horsepower and torque is all about air. Power is derived from air. An engine is nothing but an air pump. So the more air I get in and out, and of course we add fuel in there based on how much air we have to get an air-fuel ratio. Suffice it to say, the more air I get in, the more power I can make, the more fuel I can put in. If you take either one of these engines, the Ford or the Chevy, whatever your preference is, and you put the exact same cylinder heads, the flow the exact same amount of air through the cylinder heads, and you put the same camshaft package in it, and you upgrade these, and you put a roller cam in and then roller rockers to make everything more efficient with less friction, but you make everything equal between the two as far as the induction system, the intake manifold, the headers. What you find out on the dyno is the numbers are identical. You may see slight differences here and there in the power band, but the reality is when it comes to Ford and Chevy small blocks, is one better than the other? I'm going to say no. I'm going to say it's whatever your preference is, and I will say this, if you have a classic Chevy, please don't LS swap it or put a 2JZ in it. I've seen that done. Keep it original. Keep that small block or that big block Chevy in there that it came with, and keep that thing a classic. The same with a Ford. I've seen a lot of guys take LS motors and stuff them in a Ford. Man, don't do that. These small block Ford engines, if you upgrade the cylinder heads, and you can put a head and cam package on one of them for probably less than you can, swap an LS motor into that or whatever you're doing. If you want to take your Mustang and you want to swap like a big block Ford or something into it, like a 428 or a 429, that's fine, but keep the original engine with that car so that that classic is pure. My channel is vintage iron. I'm into vintage iron. I'm into the older stuff. And this is me personally, it just really bugs me when people take a classic Chevy or a Ford or even a Chrysler and they put something weird in it. You know, they take a Chevy motor and put it in a Ford. That's just, to me, that's, I don't know. That just doesn't rub me the right way. And so don't think that you're going to get an advantage by swapping something else into it. The Ford small block Windsor engine and the Ford small block Chevy engine have incredibly high potential for power on the street, and they also have huge aftermarket support. It used to be that everybody built a small block Chevy because you couldn't get any parts for the Ford. I would say that there is just as much aftermarket support now for the small block Ford engines as there is for the Chevrolet small block. It wasn't always that way, but it is now. There's lots of aftermarket companies that are making parts. And again, the cylinder heads on either one of them, the iron heads that are on the Chevrolet from the factory are okay for a mild engine. Back in the day, we had the camel humps, and we used to use those, and everybody thought, oh, that's high performance. Now we have the Vortex. But even the Vortex and the camel humps, and the Vortex are probably the best of the two as far as performance goes. The problem is the Vortex crack like crazy. They're a weak, thin casting, and they just crack. The small block Ford heads, for the most part, are pretty terrible. So the stock iron heads on Fords, they're not even worth working on. If you want any kind of performance or power, you've got to, sell those off to some guy that needs them for a landscaping truck or something. But if you want to really make power with a small block Ford or small block Chevy, you've got to go with like a dart head or an AFR or a trick flow or something of that nature, something that really flows a lot of air into this thing so we can get air and fuel into it. Remember, it's an air pump. And your Ford, it doesn't know it's a Ford. Your Chevrolet, it doesn't know it's a Chevy. It has a 4-inch bore. It has a 3.5-inch stroke. They pull air and fuel in, combust it, and push it out. The more air I can get in, the more fuel I can get in, the more power I can make. And of course, there's a lot more to the build than that. But essentially, airflow into the engine is what makes power. And if I have the same bore and stroke combination, it doesn't matter if it's a Ford, it doesn't matter if it's a Chevy, it doesn't matter if it's a Toyota, it makes no difference. If it's the same 90-degree V8 configuration and the compression ratios are similar and so forth, you're going to make essentially the same amount of power with the same head and cam package intake and induction system. All the power is in the top end, the heads, the cam, the intake, and the exhaust as well. So that's my conclusion, is that these are both great engines. They both have huge potential, but dump the factory induction and head package. The factory heads are junk. Now you'll hear Ford guys say, oh, I got GT40 heads. When you float GT40 heads, and I've floated a lot of them on the flow bench, to be honest, they're pretty terrible. The reason that they make such a big difference with the small block Ford, and it's such an improvement, is because the non-GT40 heads, or just the stock like E7 heads or whatever, are horrible flowing heads. Ford did not do a good job on those heads. And the same thing's true with the Chevy. When you flow the Vortex heads, they're not that great compared to aftermarket stuff. Compared to the pre-Vortex heads, when they flow pretty good. But remember, the pre-Vortex heads, like the 882s and the 991s and all those just factory 350 castings, they have terrible flow numbers, guys, when you compare them to the aftermarket heads that are available. They're just not going to make the power that is possible from these engines. So in addition to, basically looking at these motors and say, yeah, they're pretty similar, they have their own caveats, when it comes to power, my advice is dump all the factory heads on both Chevy and Ford and get yourself some killer aftermarket heads. Personally, I like Trick Flow. I use them all the time. And we make really big power with these motors. 500 horsepower with ease on a build. And that's for a pretty mild street motor with a streetable cam. So I hope you enjoyed this, and that is my take and my look at this. If you disagree with me, I'm sure I'm going to get a bunch of haters on here that tell me, well, you know, you made a mistake here, and Ford didn't do that, and you know, please don't like write me a 3,000 word essay on why I did something wrong. I'm sure I don't know everything about these motors. I just know what my experience is and some of the stuff that I've researched. But I'm sure there's things that I missed and got wrong, and that's fine if you correct me, right? But don't write me a manifesto and post it. I'm just going to delete that because, you know, nobody's going to read it, number one. Nobody cares about, you know, once in a while you get a purist on there and they're just, oh my gosh, it takes me a half hour to read it, and I don't even finish reading it. They're like, you know, the design feature in 65, you know, the engineers and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, come on, man. It's a 90-degree V8 with a 4-inch bore and a 3.5-inch stroke. Let's build it and make some power. So thanks for watching. I appreciate it, and I will talk to you very soon, I promise.